It is a real pleasure to be here today. And, it's kind of intimidating because many of the giants of this work on concentration are here or coming today. But what I've wanted to do is to try to take the really deep and important work that a lot of you have done and take it on the road to try to explain to a growing generation of food activists how we have really ended up with this dysfunctional food system. And I would say a dysfunctional democracy, right? So I wanted to tell a story about where it began, because if we don't know where we've been, it's really hard to know where we're going. So what I've been trying to do as I've traveled around the country to bookstores and talking to people in the good food movement is to really go back and start, before the Depression, to explain food policy and how we ended up getting here. And the way I tell the story is by beginning in the Depression, and we all know that the financial services industry was engaged in the same bad behavior then that they have been recently. And it caused a horrible depression in the country, and rural people, farmers, were especially hard hit. In fact, we lost about a quarter of all farms during that period before the Depression. And it's important to note that in the 1930s, we had about 6.8 million farms still. Now, when the Roosevelt administration came into office, as many of you know, they tried to initiate some policies that would put rural incomes on par with urban incomes. And, a term that most people don't know today, parity. And to do that, they initiated some policies, supply management, so that there wouldn't be overproduction, because overproduction has always been the bane of farmers, right? They made it possible to take millions of acres of land out of production, and a lot of that was marginal land, so it also was really good for the environment and to stop the erosion that was going on. And I know a lot about that period in history when the Dust Bowl, because my dad actually grew up during the Dust Bowl, and I grew up with stories about the Dust Bowl and how really difficult it was, because my dad had grown up in Oklahoma and in fact took us back to a farm, bought a farm in what is today Northern Virginia. And so I grew up on a farm and know a little bit about farming and know a lot about those stories about how tough it was to be a farmer before the Roosevelt administration really stepped in and began to try to do some things. Now, another policy that they initiated in 1937 was a grain reserve. All these things seem kind of common sense, don't they? And when you look back in history, the Chinese have had a grain reserve, well, since the time of Confucius. And I think in Genesis we heard about a grain reserve as well, right? So it seems like something that makes a lot of sense. Now, these policies that the Roosevelt administration started were really very successful for rural people and for consumers too. It stabilized the price of food. And during World War II, you'll remember that the U.S. really provided the food for the Allies. And after World War II, when Europe was devastated and when the colonial governments were falling around the world, it was the U.S. farmers who stepped in and were producing food. And the rural countryside was flourishing at that time. Good incomes, things were really doing very well. Now, after World War II, not everyone was so pleased with rural people having a good standard of living and the fact that there were a lot of farms. There was a cabal of business leaders who believed that farmers were excess labor, and really that young men needed to be sent to the urban areas of this country to be factory labor. And some of these young men, or some of these business leaders got together and they formed an organization that I actually learned about on a trip when I was out interviewing people for Foodopoly, and I was at the Farmers Union in Nebraska, and I was handed some documents about an organization called the Committee for Economic Development. And many of you probably know about this CED. And it was started by, Paul Hoffman, who was the president of Studebaker. He went on to be an administrator for the Marshall Plan and one of the architects of the Green Revolution. Marion Folsom, who was an executive at Kodak Eastman, and he went on to be a Treasury Secretary under the Eisenhower administration. And another individual named William Hoffman, who was actually one of the first people who had done research on how you change consumers' minds. Now, these business leaders got together and formed this organization because they wanted to really ditch these policies from the New Deal, not just the farm policies, but especially the farm policies. And they set about recruiting most of the business leaders in the country. And so by the 1950s, they were pretty powerful. And the first 15 years of their existence, 38 of these business leaders held public office, and 2 of them were actually Federal Reserve Bank presidents. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is some kind of wild conspiracy. This is just men of a common class and background getting together and strategizing, you know, kind of like we are here today. They just had a lot more influence and resources to work with. Now, by the 1950s, they had been able to begin to influence government. And you probably know that under the Eisenhower administration, there was a Secretary of Agriculture named Ezra Benson. Now, Ezra Benson was pretty much of an ideologue. He believed that the New Deal farm policies were going to lead the country down the road to communism. And you'll remember that this was the period of the McCarthy hearings, and it was easy to demonize farmers. And he was able to use his position as Secretary of Agriculture to actually begin to chip away slightly at parity. And in fact, things did get to be tougher on the farm. Now, meanwhile, through the 1950s, the CED and other like-minded people began to have more political power. In fact, the CED was able to recruit most of the publishing industry, or at least the most important people in publishing, most of the major universities' economics departments, and the people who are in charge of our most important institutions in the United States. And by early 1960s, they felt that they were poised to get rid of what they called excess labor. And John, I was pointing out that it was on a visit to your office that I really learned about this CED.
The excess human resource.
Yeah. So in 1962, they put out a report called an Adaptive Plan for Agriculture. And it was really a screed about how policies needed to change to get rid of the the New Deal farm programs, and that the training program for young men in rural areas needed to change, that people needed to be directed into urban areas, and it was really making the case for the need for cheap factory labor. And 2 years later, the CED wrote a report about what they called free trade. And when you look at that report, it looks very much like the policies that were actually initiated under the Clinton administration in the mid-1990s. So it's very obvious that these people at the CED and their allies, because these reports were widely circulated in the media and among academics and to policy leaders, making the case that the programs that really managed supply needed to go. And we know who is behind this kind of lobbying. Now, going into the 1970s, under the Nixon administration, one of Ezra Benson's proteges was appointed to be a Secretary of Agriculture under the Nixon administration. And I'm old enough to remember him. I'm sure many of you remember Earl Butz. Now, usually, even when I go around the country and I talk about Earl Butz, people do kind of chuckle because he was quite a character, and it's really a shame that he had such a major impact on our political economy. But I can remember being a teenager out on our farm in Virginia, and in those days, you'll remember, there were about 4 channels on television, and at dinner time, people turned on the news. And I can remember Earl Butz just with his big ego in there talking about farmers, and I didn't really understand it at the time, but I have a real clear image of him and his voice. And he really hated farmers, and he wanted to help Richard Nixon get reelected, and so he decided with the Nixon administration to put together a deal that would help encourage farmers to vote for Richard Nixon, because it was during a period when the Soviet Union was experiencing a disaster with grains and didn't have enough grains. So he plotted with some of the biggest grain traders in the country, Cargill, ConAgra, to do a big grain deal with the Soviet Union. And he'd been out talking about the new export economy. So the grain industry, grain traders made just under $2 billion on that deal. And the price of bread skyrocketed for Americans. And that pretty well sums it up for Earl Butz. But he did travel around the country, and he lectured farmers about the need to get big or get out, to plant from fence row to fence row, and to borrow a lot of money from the banks, and to buy a lot of equipment, because there was going to be a huge export market in grains, and the U.S. had the advantage in grains. And this goes back to the CED trade report, where they talked about the U.S. should produce grains and the rest of the world should produce fruits and vegetables and the things that it's more expensive to produce. And so Earl Butz, unfortunately, did use his position on the speaking tour that he did throughout his life to get farmers in the 1970s to borrow a lot of money, to buy a lot of equipment, to plant fence row to fence row, and it meant that when there was no export market, that farms began to go out of business, and it was really the beginning of the really serious modern agricultural crisis. And it is a good thing to point out that Earl Butz did eventually get fired. He made comments under the Ford administration. Ford administration inherited him. He was in Rome, and he made some lewd comments about the Pope, and didn't get fired for that, but the next year he made comments, racial slurs, and Ford finally ended up firing Earl Butz. But he still traveled around the country giving this bad advice to farmers, and he lived to be 101. Now that just seems to be really unfair, doesn't it? Now, what happened is that the politics of the nation had begun to change. And you'll remember that it was during the 1950s and into the 1960s that a new breed of economist was coming onto the scene. And people like Milton Friedman, Alan Greenspan, known as the Chicago School, under the tutelage of Ayn Rand. And these economists wanted people to believe that economics is a hard science, and they were able to actually change the language around what a market is. And we know that a market is created through politics, legislation, regulation. The political economy is created by the rules in society. But this Chicago school wanted people to believe that the market is some natural force, some magic, mystical force that needs no human intervention. And they used this language under the guise of being efficient, and they began to change the language in the country under the guise of helping consumers. Excuse me. So by the 1980s, this group of, well, I would call them radical revolutionaries, these economists and the people who were supporting them, and a lot of money was going into actually changing the politics of the country. People like, we hear a lot about the Koch brothers' involvement in elections today. Well, their father was one of the funders of this very radical movement to change the definition of what the economy is, really for the benefit of the wealthiest people in the country. And people like Richard Mellon Scaife in the 1980s began funding this movement to really change our political economy. And this had a dire effect on agriculture as well as our entire political economy, as we see today with the dramatic stratification that we have. And some of that money helped actually elect Ronald Reagan, who came in with an agenda of deregulation. Now, especially deregulating antitrust law, because this language, this fake language around efficiency and how it wasn't efficient to have antitrust law, really was able to make a lot of headway under the Reagan administration, which came into office with an agenda of getting rid of our antitrust laws. And I had the opportunity in writing Foodopoly to actually interview Michael Perchuk, who had been a commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission, one of the agencies that's responsible for enforcing antitrust law, and the DOJ being one of the others. That's very important. And Michael Perchuk told me the sad story of what happened when the Reagan administration came into office. And, you know, things you would expect at the FTC, dramatically cut the budget, got rid of whole departments, made the morale at the agency very poisonous, and probably most importantly, narrowed the definition of what an antitrust violation is. And Barry Lynn, who's sitting in the back of the room, has written extensively about this in his book, Cornered. But this has had probably one of the most dramatic effects on our society as anything else that's happened in the last several decades. And what it meant is that companies could merge, acquire one another, and become as big as they so desired. Now, we all know that traditionally we associate this with price and things being more expensive when there's a monopoly. But I think that what we don't talk about enough in our society is how monopolies actually buy public policy. And isn't that exactly what's happened? We allowed in the 1980s the beginning of this merger and acquisition frenzy that has created companies too big to fail, right? And this has meant that a handful of companies who are very, very, very wealthy have a lot of influence over our political institutions. And so in the trade agreements that were beginning to be negotiated during the Reagan administration and the first Bush administration and going into the 1990s, these companies had an enormous amount of political power. And they were able to basically put forward their idea using this language of efficiency about what our trade policies should be. And you'll remember that Cargill put together a coalition during this time of more than 100 companies related to producing food to begin discussing what kind of trade policies they wanted, and to sit in smoky rooms and debate among themselves how they were going to divide up the globe's food system, basically. And so we had Cargill in a position to write the agreement on agriculture, basically. And we've had to live with that. Now, what the Reagan administration started, the Clinton administration finished, right? Because we have two political parties that really completely agree on these economic issues. And they use personal issues to try to keep their bases loyal and enraged at one another so they can go about their business of making the wealthy as possible. So under the Clinton administration, and it probably didn't hurt that Clinton was from Arkansas, the home of Tyson, Walmart, and so forth. The trade rules that govern us today were negotiated, and the Clinton administration never saw a merger that they didn't like, other than Microsoft, and that's another story. But under the Clinton administration, we saw a lot of the things that began under the Reagan administration culminate. So I think what happened to the media is probably one of the most dramatic, and I think it's had one of the biggest effects on the loss of democracy that we're experiencing today. When the Clinton administration came into office, and I'm borrowing these statistics from Cornered, there were 50 large media companies. When the Clinton administration left office, there were 5 media companies. And today, with the concentration in the media, we have very little discussion about the major issues of the day. We have basically a lot of dribble, and dribble under the guise of entertainment. Now, what happened with the trade agreements really dramatically changed our country and our food system. And today, depending on how you cut the statistics, as much as 50% of the value of food is coming in imports. And look at China. At Food and Water Watch a couple of years ago, we We looked at processed food. We put together something that you can go to and look at on the internet called the Global Grocer and see where your fruits and vegetables are coming from. China is now about the third largest producer of processed fruits and vegetables. We've seen many of those packing houses, or rather the food processing facilities that were in the Central Valley of California moved to places like China. And in fact, when you go into Whole Foods and buy that organic corn in the frozen counter, there's a good chance that that actually came from China. So, we've really offshored our food production. And what we've done is we've allowed a handful of companies to really control our food system. Now, when I'm out on the road talking to foodies and doing this rap at bookstores, I usually make everybody stand up and I ask them if they've ever eaten one of these brands. I'm not going to do that today, but I do want to read this list of brands because I think it's pretty dramatic. Let me just find it here on my iPad. And I usually ask people, why am I reading this particular list of brands? So here's the list. Pepsi, Mountain Dew, Aquafina, Sierra Mist, Tazo, Sobe, Slice, Lipton, Propel, Gatorade, Tropicana, Naked Juice, Captain Crunch, Aunt Jemima Near East, Rice-A-Roni, Pasta-Roni, Puffed Wheat, Harvest Crunch, Quaker Quisp, King Vitamin, Mother's Lay's, Maui Style, Ruffles, Doritos, Cheetos, Rolled Gold, Sun Gold, Sabertones, Cracker Jacks, Chester's, Grandma's Munchos, Smart Food Baconates, Matador Hickory Sticks, Hostess Chips, Miss Vicky's Munchies, True North. I won't read the whole list. Now, and then I usually ask people, who makes these products? Because it's the largest food company in our country, PepsiCo. And, that's being generous, right, to call PepsiCo a food company, because most of those items I would not say are food. So what we're left with today are 20 large food processing companies that control more than 60% of the brands in our grocery store. And consumers walk into the grocery store and they see all of these brands and all of the aisles, all of the color, and they believe that there's a lot of choice and diversity, when really we have this small cabal of companies that are producing most of these foods. And these companies have been able, through their political power, to basically dictate all of the rules around how food is produced. So, advertising. Let's look at advertising. The average child sees just under 5,000 junk food ads on television every year. And the processed food industry has figured out that children at the age of 3 actually have brand identification. And children are one of the most important factors in what the family eats. And we all know that junk food cereal is placed at eye level, or that candy at the checkout counter. And these companies have been able to run wild with our health, with our children's health, and to use a combination of fat, sugar, and salt to basically addict people to junk food. And I'm not making that up. There's a lot of research about that, beginning with the former Surgeon General David Kessler, and some recent books about the fact that food scientists have literally figured out how to use these ingredients to trigger a hormone in the brain that makes people want to go back for the same junk foods. In fact, they drive by their favorite junk food, fast food place, and they start salivating. I mean, this is really criminal behavior in my estimation. But even these food processing companies are not on top of the food heap. We really have to look at the company that has the most impact on our food system, and I would say one of the largest impacts on our society, especially all of the rural areas that are now destitute and the population has been drained out, and there basically is a much lower quality of life than in the past. And that is Walmart. Today we have a grocery industry that overall controls 50% of sales, but that makes it seem like they don't have as much power as they do, because overall these four companies, Walmart, the Kroger brands, Costco, and Target, have in many markets in the country, many local regional markets, control 70 to 90% of the market. And this gives them an enormous amount of power. I like the way Barry Lynn describes it in Cornered. Walmart is a reincarnation of the British East India Company and an arm of China, basically. And you know, that's pretty much where things are today. And Walmart has been able to create this system that other companies, other box stores, other chains are copying. They figured out how to suck all of the profit from the ground all the way up into their coffers. And today, 1 out of 3 grocery dollars is spent at Walmart, and the Walmart heirs have as much wealth as the 40% lowest income Americans. I mean, that's a pretty shocking statistic, and I would say that's a metaphor for what's wrong with our society today. They have been able to force suppliers to use their logistics systems, their data systems. The suppliers are responsible for getting products on the shelf. They have to give high volume discounts. If there's a problem, or Walmart believes that there's a problem on their end, they fine the suppliers. And we all know what the impact has been on food and farming with the need for volume. Walmart needs 1 billion pounds of beef every year. Now, do they want to have arrangements with independent farmers and meat packers? No, they want to deal with a few giants. It's more convenient, and they can use the pressure to continue reducing price, because this whole idea that we have to continually have lower prices is eroding the quality of our food, the quality of products, the quality of life, and I would say the quality of our democracy. So that rather than raising the income, the stagnant income of Americans, and a middle class that is disappearing, we have a situation where we have a company like Walmart that says that it's fulfilling a need in society by having constantly lower prices. So even Walmart, though, obviously is really not on the top of the heap, because who really benefits from this economic system that we have today? Really, it's the banks, it's the financial services industry. Our political economy is really today a tool to strip the wealth from everyone else for just that half of 1%. So really, though, I didn't write Foodopoly, and I haven't been traveling around the country since January talking about this to just be a bummer and to say how really terrible things are. My purpose in writing Foodopoly, and really it's been just to provide a platform to talk about what's happening with our food system, and our target for having this discussion is really the good food movement. Because our view is that what's happening is really about our democracy, because really we're not going to fix our food system if we don't fix our democracy. And we need to engage large numbers of people if we're going to really fix our democracy. Because most people come to issues or come to political work via issues. And we need people to, yes, vote with their fork, but we need them to vote with their vote. And then we need to really hold the people accountable that we vote for. Because we have a system a political system that's not working for most Americans today. And it's been very disturbing to us at Food and Water Watch to kind of see how people in the Good Food movement have been persuaded that we're actually going to change the food system through local agriculture, through direct sales. And I know that I may generate a debate here about that, and I think that's a good thing. Because I think that direct sales do actually benefit a very small percentage of the farmers and consumers that can engage in direct sales. And I have to say that, you know, I was lucky enough as an only child to inherit my family's farm, which is run as a CSA today. But that is because I was very fortunate, and my dad bought some scrub land 45 miles from Washington, D.C., land that was worthless then because he didn't have a lot of money. And today it's near one of the largest metropolitan areas in the country. And there's a movement of people who are interested in local food. Although I will say that even for CSAs, it's becoming much more competitive because so many people want to do farming. And so I actually think that we see even the ability to make money through direct sales diminishing. And when you look at the numbers, you know, the USDA kind of lies about the number of farmers in this country. They say there are 2.1 million farmers, but 2/3 of those farmers actually make under $10,000 in sales every year. You know, there are people like my friend who is actually retired from the University of Virginia, who grows flowers at a farmer's market in Charlottesville because she really enjoys growing flowers. You know, the fact that USDA sends her the paperwork and counts her as a farmer is really an outrage. Or it's like my neighbor who is retired from the CIA and has a vineyard because, you know, it's prestigious in Virginia to have a vineyard. He has under $10,000 of sales. He's really not a farmer. But even the USDA says there are 2.1 million farmers, and that 1/3 of them live near urban areas. So I don't know how many farmers really live near urban areas, but my sense is it's a lot lower than 1/3. So are we really going to be dependent on a good food system where farmers have to go out in rural Nebraska and rural Iowa and Kansas and Missouri, and they're going to have to find people to buy their products? I don't think this is the kind of food system that works in a post-industrial society. I think it's great where it does work, but we need to be fighting for the kind of policies that create a food system that works for everybody and a political economy that works for everybody. And we need to educate people that this monopolization is not working for most Americans and that it's corrupting our political system. And I think that that is something that actually appeals to people. And one of the things that's given me the most hope as I've traveled around the country is how mad Americans are. I mean, Americans want to do something. They just want to see the path. And so we need to really get people involved in elections. We need to bring the good food movement along to get involved in some of these systemic changes that need to take place. And to do that, it takes a lot of education. And that's the kind of education that you folks have been doing over the last 15 years, and that new generations of people will need to pick up, and that our job is really to take this message out and to politicize people, because this is about politics, and we have to have the long view in these fights, and we have to look at history and know that, you know, we may be moving towards serfdom again, but people have fought back over thousands of years to reclaim their enclosed areas
And we are going to do that, right? We are going to have the kind of political revolution that we need to, and I mean in the most positive and peaceful sense. So thanks a lot for listening to me, and I look forward to working with all of you to change the politics of this country.